Come join Melissa and her guests on the Chats from the Blog Cabin podcast. From North Carolina, this podcast will have you feeling like you've known these folks for years. Listen in as they chat about life, culture, current events, and more, all with a special Southern flair. Curl up with your favorite beverage and get ready to be entertained. Tune in now for a unique experience that's fun and insightful.
Hey y'all, welcome back to another episode of Chats from the Blog Cabin. You know, the show where I virtually invite people into the blog cabin to chat about life. And today we're chatting about trauma. I think trauma is something very important that we all need to talk about. Sometimes it's the hidden little taboo that we don't talk about. And Duygu, right? Yes, I said it right that time, is here. And she's going to talk about her book, Rewrite the Trauma Workbook, of creative writing and recovery in our new normal. But before we get into that, let's talk about you. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah. So my name is Duygu Balan, and I'm a psychotherapist. I'm bi-coastal. I practice in San Francisco Bay Area in New York City, and I specialize in trauma and attachment wounding.
Yeah. So how did you get into this type of work?
So I was always interested in the human psyche and just the human condition and existential questions throughout my teenage years. And I studied psychology in Istanbul, actually, where I'm from. And then I did my grad school here in New York. And I started working actually with youth offenders in the Bronx. And that is when I realized that I didn't want to do anything other than working with trauma. It felt such a privilege to be allowed into the darker side of the human condition. And then from there, I just continued working. And now I'm in private practice and I work with familial trauma and attachment wounding predominantly.
Well, that's just there. It takes a special person to want to work and help someone go through healing from their trauma. So I applaud you 100% for that, because I honestly don't think I could sit there without breaking my heart to hear some of the stories that you have probably heard in your lifetime.
Yeah, it is difficult, and I think there is definitely a need to have practices in place that allow for, my own care. And one of the things that really is important is a support network with other clinicians, because therapy is actually quite a lonely job. Mm-hmm. And you just have to figure out a mechanism for your own self where you can process certain emotions that come up. You're holding a lot of pain, and how you process this pain becomes a skill within itself.
So what do you suggest for self-care, or what do you do for self-care to make sure that you take care of yourself so that you're at the best for your patients or your clients that you're dealing with?
Yeah. So for me, one thing is I'm very mindful about my schedule, because I have a tendency, I could just take on and take on and take on without realizing how much I have taken, how full my plate is. So one thing that I do is, before I sign up for everything, I take a minute, and that really, that works for me. Also, I have great connections with amazing clinicians who I can basically call whenever I need. And that is an amazing privilege that I really hold sacred, because, things come up for you as well. So certain emotions may come up for you, or your own story might get triggered when you're working with trauma. And it just can become really heavy. So, and it's not really something that you can necessarily share with the world. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it feels very much like, you just sit there and listen to these heavy topics, and then going out into the world and functioning in the day-to-day feels very challenging. So for that reason, other clinicians who have similar experiences is a very helpful thing for me that I utilize a lot. And then other than that, I love moving. Dancing has always been something that I use to self-regulate. So dancing practices or mindfulness practices such as yoga and meditation, I try to make sure that I have something every day. And it doesn't have to be a full hour or anything, but even if it's 10, 15 minutes, I try to make sure that I have something to regulate my body and my nervous system every single day. Since my job is to teach it to other people, I have to make sure that I do it for myself first.
So tell us what exactly, define trauma for us, because a lot of people think, oh, trauma from a car accident or but trauma can be just about anything, correct?
It could be just about anything. And it basically, what trauma is the notion of whatever worked yesterday will work today is being shattered. So all the tools that you have that you use to cope don't feel like they're not going to work the next day. That is trauma, which is why the pandemic was such a collective trauma, because everything that we knew until that moment wasn't applicable anymore. Our social networks, our extracurricular activities, anything that we use to regulate ourselves wasn't available. So it's trauma is in a nutshell that. And oftentimes people talk about trauma as like this one-time incident, but a lot of times trauma, especially within the families, is a chain of events. So it's not isolated to one particular incident. And there's a lot of trauma that is being overlooked. For instance, bullying can be very traumatic and can be very shattering lead to people having misconstrued beliefs about their identity or their place in the world. So yes, trauma can be anything.
So let's talk about the impact of unspoken trauma.
So unspoken trauma is basically trauma that we just overlook. For instance, in relationships, especially now with social media and the dating apps leading the dating world, basically, there is a lot of relationship trauma that is overlooked and not discussed. For instance, one of these things that is very common is ghosting, or seeing somebody's stories online or social media online, because you can see that somebody sees it and not replying to their text or something like that. These kind of behaviors actually can create abandonment issues, can create a feeling of rejection, can really impact self-esteem negatively, but we don't really talk about that as trauma. But toxic relationships can be really traumatic. And similarly, in schools, bullying or cyberbullying, these kind of things is often overlooked, but happens every day and really interferes with somebody's feelings of connection to other people.
So why do you think trauma is not spoken about like it should be? Like it really should be out in the open, and we should be talking about it more and trying to find ways to help each other deal with our trauma.
I think it's changing. I think, especially with the new generation, I think they are actually very much more aware of mental health issues, and they're also much more open to vulnerability. They're much more open for mental health advocacy. They talk about it much more. They talk about their own feelings more. And so I really do think that it is changing. The reason why it's not spoken as much is because it's uncomfortable. People don't want to talk about difficult topics. It's a mechanism, a survival mechanism of all of us to avoid things that are uncomfortable. So it comes from the need of avoiding, because we just avoid and move on with our lives. Also, I think in our societies right now, it's not really celebrated, right? Are kind of like everything is about suppressing these emotions. But the thing is that the more we suppress and the more we don't talk about trauma and the difficulties of the human psyche, then we basically are creating a soil where these uncomfortable emotions can grow and result in these repeating patterns.
That's true. So how do we deal with the trauma?
There's many different ways. I am a big believer in therapy, of course.
Yes.
I think the therapeutic relationship is really powerful. It's not for everybody, so it's not the only way. I always make sure that I say that clearly. There's many different ways of healing, but therapy is definitely one of them. And basically what it is human connection is one of them. So it doesn't have to be in connection to another therapist, a clinician, but it could be in connection to another human or another group of people. Like group therapy actually for survivors is very effective, because a lot of times when we're traumatized, the understanding is that we're alone in the world, that this doesn't happen to anybody else. But when we're in groups who have had similar experiences, for instance, child of alcoholic parents, or domestic violence survivors, then the understanding is that I'm not alone, and my experience is not just isolated to me, and it makes sense that I'm feeling the way I'm feeling. This kind of validation is very important for our psychic growth. And then in the individual level, therapy just serves where something different can happen between two people. So for instance, when your therapist shows up on time and listens to you genuinely, and your emotions and your feelings matter, that understanding might be very different than, for instance, a parent who never allowed you to express your emotions. So when we have these different experiences, we can actually transfer them to the world around us and have different type of relating to people, and actually choose people who will validate our emotions and will kind of help us grow. So that is, I think, very powerful. Creativity is very powerful. There's definitely a link between trauma and the creative process, and or any kind of it could be anything. It doesn't have to be writing, although writing I feel like is very accessible, more accessible than many other things. But it could be drama, it could be dancing, it could be painting, and just allowing for these emotions that we are holding to be expressed in whatever format that they are called to express them.
So yes, that's so important. But we need to take a brief commercial break, and then we'll be right back, and we'll talk more about your book.
Okay.
People welcomed me, and they knew the pain of the journey that we'd been on because they'd been there too.
Other Parents Like Me is an online community, peer-led, for parents with kids struggling with mental health and or substances.
It's a space that's safe. Feels like I can actually share what's going on.
We offer 15 daily support groups per week and live speaker talks on Thursdays, as well as a monthly expert panel.
We also have a resource hub that has a toolkit. This includes over 1,000 articles, podcasts. There's a glossary with the most recent and relevant terms. And we have a directory that's been vetted.
The overwhelming feeling when we're sitting in a meeting and I'm telling my story and I see others shaking their head, tears falling, they understand this roller coaster and they're along for the ride.
And we are back talking to Oh my gosh. I had it, but I was like, I don't want to say it wrong. So we're talking about trauma. You just talked about creative process and writing. Is that one of the reasons why you wrote the book, Rewrite the Trauma Workbook of Creative Writing and Recovery in Our New Normal?
Yes, the book came about during the pandemic, actually. The need for mental health services was increased so significantly during that time. And I was experiencing that in my own private practice as well. People were calling me for extra sessions. And I decided to kind of have some practices, some tools available that they could use between sessions. And that is how the writing exercises and all the other tools, the grounding tools, came about. Then I created a book around it. And also, I feel like during the pandemic, a lot of the people that I work with, which is mostly young adults, like in their 20s, were resorting to social media for self-diagnosis. And that felt really dangerous to me, to diagnose yourself through, not evidence-based information. So I wanted to have something that had combined all of this. I wanted to have some theoretical information that was digestible, along with writing exercises and also other techniques, so that someone could really benefit from it in a more holistic way.
Now, do you think, you keep mentioning the pandemic, do you think because of the pandemic, people are more likely to reach out for help now? Or do you think people are more likely to kind of bury their trauma?
I think it's changing. I think people are reaching out more. There's definitely more, there's definitely the reality that people are avoiding and burying, especially I think among men. Women tend to be more open about their therapeutic process. I actually, interestingly, during the pandemic again, noticed that many men that I'm working with, which is pretty equal, like pretty 50-50, I would say, my practice. And it was just so interesting that many men, their partners didn't even know that they were in therapy. So it's not something that is there's still stigma around it. But there's also a change around it. There's also people reaching out more, and there's many more, much more awareness around different types of healing techniques. So it's not just therapy, but group therapy actually has been increased a lot more. And there's a lot more other practices, like yoga is much more incorporated. And that, I think, is making a difference too. So people are talking about it more and more. I think they should talk about it much more, and we should see therapy in mainstream media, in novels and movies, even more than we already do. But I think we are in the path to that.
Yeah, because you do see it in mainstream movies and TV some, but most of the time it's like, it's almost joked about, oh, I have to go see my therapist, or I have to go do this. It's like offhand, like a taboo subject that you don't want to talk about. But I think you're right. It does need to be more out there, because mental health is so important, and it's actually stronger for someone to ask for help than to just sit in silence suffering on their own. Correct?
Definitely. It takes courage to reach out and ask for help. And that is definitely the first step. I think I always tell people that you're halfway through your healing by doing something about it, by reaching out and sharing it to another person, because we need to be witnessed in our pain. That's how we just function as humans. We have to be in connection to another. Human beings get injured in relationships, but we also heal in relationships. So it's important to remember that.
Yeah, I love what you just said about witness in our pain. Like, somebody is like, you've said the words again. You said validation. You said, knowing your feelings are valid, because a lot of times if you're bringing up this trauma, especially with family members, and you're bringing it up, family members tend to say, that didn't happen, or you're crazy, or, you're thinking about things that never really happened. It didn't happen the way that you're saying it did. But being able to go to someone and say, hey, I'm not judging you, but I'm letting you have a space to share your thoughts, share your feelings, and that they're valid. That's important.
That's definitely, and memory is unreliable, but I don't think it matters. The story, the cover story doesn't matter. What matters is the sensations and the emotions and the reactions to certain triggers. That's what matters, and that is what we are healing. So we're not necessarily focusing on the story, because the mind creates different versions of it. But what we're focusing is, if that is the sensation, if that is the emotional response, that's true. There's no, you can never judge or second guess anybody's emotions, because it's not up to you.
Yeah, I love that, because a lot of times there's that family scapegoat where everything's blamed on that one person, when in fact they're the only one that's really telling the truth, because they want to get everything out and have their voice be heard.
Yeah, that's true.
So let's talk about, you talked about writing and the power of the arts. Now let's talk about how it can transform you from writing it down, like using your book and writing and creative writing, getting all your emotions out on the page. How does that help?
It helps, because so a lot of times, our talking brain isn't necessarily doesn't necessarily go deep enough. So when we're writing, we're actually tapping into another, like a little deeper than our conversational thoughts. And actually the body is even deeper than that, which is why with the writing, I always incorporate it with body exercises and breathing exercises, because with the body, we can even go deeper to the sensations where there are maybe no words to certain things that we're experiencing. But when we allow for free association, just for our thoughts to flow out, we actually might be really surprised how we make sense of certain things that happen to us. We could notice certain patterns that keep repeating. I think it really helps with awareness, and it really helps with organizing our thoughts and noticing our emotions. And that is the most important piece, is to be able to notice our emotions and allow for those emotions to be experienced before they can move.
Now, in your practice, do you use have your clients do creative writing and then bring it in and you discuss it, or you just use it as a say, hey, get all your feelings out on paper, they're for your use only?
It depends. Some people actually really like sharing their writing with me. So I do work with a lot of creatives. So I work with, people who are, actors and work in theater. So I also have people who actually write screenplays and they, act out certain things. And I think psychodrama can be really powerful too. So of course, there's a limited time. We're limited to 50 minutes. So I can't I feel like using the time for them reading me the 10 pages that they wrote is not the best use maybe, but there's definitely people read a little something from what they're writing to their journal, or they discuss it, or we're mostly focusing on the experience of the writing, but it changes. It depends on the person.
I love that. What are some strategies for healing though from this trauma? What can we do? Like if we we've already said it takes a strong person to ask for help, but there may be people out there that still have that stigma. Oh, if I go to a therapist or a counselor or see somebody, that I'm going to get, ostracized from my family, or I'm going to go do this, or I don't feel right doing this because of what society has kind of put in a little hole. What are some strategies that we can do? Of course, we need to work with a mental health counselor, but to help prepare either to go to a mental health counselor or get to the point where we're like, okay, it's time for me to actually get some help.
So if there is any kind of thoughts or plan for self-harm or harming anybody else, then absolutely it is time to seek emergency help, either 911 or going to the nearest emergency room. And if the emotions are getting in the way of living your life in the way that you want to live, if it gets in the way of social relationships, of being able to connect to others, or being able to do things that you normally love to do, or your work or academic success, if it's getting in the way and interfering with your day-to-day, then it is definitely a good idea to reach out for help. And it could be reaching out to loved ones or a community. It could be reaching out to resources. For instance, church has or religious practices have a lot of resources. It could be a clinician, whatever feels supportive to that person. It could be group therapy, as I mentioned. It's important to make sure that we reach out to others, because when we are able to connect with another person, actually that's when the healing begins. So definitely, I think there's the stigma around it is changing. We have a lot of judgment around certain things still, but that is also moving to a kind of a more awareness, and people are becoming more aware of mental health. And also, it doesn't really matter what other people think. What matters is that we take care of ourselves and we, advocate for ourselves in whatever form that might be.
That is so true. How do we know if we're like in the process of dealing with trauma? Because most of the time people are not aware that trauma years later, it's like all of a sudden things are starting to come up. How can we be aware of like when it's happening right at the moment or later on down the line that we're responding to something that's been traumatic in our past, or maybe something that's traumatic that's happening right now?
So if the reaction to the current event is more than what it's supposed to be, that is a good indication that you're being triggered. Like, for instance, if you're getting dysregulated in an excessive way to something that is not that big of a deal. Like, for instance, if you're waiting in line and you're getting impatient and somebody bumps you from the back and you just startle and like start screaming, that level of dysregulation might indicate that there is something that was triggered in that moment. And this could be anything. This sometimes could be even a song. Sometimes people don't even realize, but there's certain songs that might bring up certain memories or put you back in time to a certain era in your life that was difficult or traumatic. So I think it's important to notice these triggers and kind of then become curious about it and try to understand why am I feeling so dysregulated when this happens? Why am I feeling so sad or angry or anxious? I think it always starts with questions.
I love that. Now, how does trauma responses impact our relationships? Because I know, as I'm just going to put it out there, as a little girl, I was told that I wasn't pretty, and that I was never going to find anybody that loved me. And for the longest time, that's how I defined myself. And it wasn't until I turned 50, even though I've been married for almost 30 years now, it wasn't until I turned 50 that I was like, no, a light switch or whatever switch flipped in my brain and was like, no, why did I think about all this for the longest time? So how does it affect our relationships?
It affects our relationships tremendously. There's certain narratives that, just as you mentioned, are passed down and that we start believing them. So, and then we actually pick people who recreate these narratives. We can pick people who recreate these narratives and keep validating the same narrative that's dysfunctional and isn't true. So, and also like people trigger one another oftentimes. That's why in couples therapy, it's very important to help couples learn how to regulate one another, be able to read each other, and be able to be in tune with their body language. And then, because before you are regulated, you can't really have a conversation. There's no room for rational conversation when you're triggered, when you're in a nervous, when your nervous system is agitated, then the only thing that you are focusing on is surviving. So your defense mechanisms are kicking in, and you're not necessarily able to have a connected relationship to another person and be able to be in tune with what they're feeling and what they're saying to you. You can't hear it. So you hear things in a very maybe different way than what they actually mean. So that's why it's important to be able to regulate yourself and also be able to regulate your partner so that you can actually meet.
And but also, how important is setting boundaries when you're dealing with trauma and it's maybe somebody that's maybe in a family relationship and you're like, this person has caused a lot of trauma for me, or words that they've said? How important is it to set boundaries around that?
Boundaries are key. I think it's also, I think in the therapeutic process, one part of it is expressing these emotions and noticing these patterns. And then the other element of it is creating boundaries and enforcing them. So boundaries are basically, and nobody's boundaries have to look the same. It's about you and what your needs are. And the most important part is to understand it for yourself first. A lot of us don't know our boundaries and don't know our needs. So I think it's becoming aware of what it is that I need and how do I get there? And saying no is definitely an option. So if we are in, for instance, for many people, holidays actually is a very difficult season because sometimes people have to go back to homes that they were abused in, or homes that, were very difficult for them, or neighborhoods that trigger a lot of trauma. So it's important to understand that that you don't, you have to take care of yourself. And sometimes that might mean distancing yourself from certain relationships and having clear boundaries. And what that looks like is completely up to that person. For some people, for instance, during the holidays, they have very clear, like, I'm going to go here and I'm going to just stay for an hour. That kind of, for some people, it's holidays is something that they want to celebrate with their friends and not go to those. And all of that is okay. Whatever that person needs to take care of themselves and make sure that they don't get re-traumatized is okay.
So let's go back to your book, Rewrite the Trauma Workbook of Creative Writing. What exactly is in the book, so that way people are like, okay, I want to rewrite my trauma, but why do I need this workbook? Tell us why we need this workbook.
So in this workbook can be used in a clinical setting, but also is for individual use. And it's not in order. You don't have to read it in order. Like if there's different topics. It could be like there's information about what trauma is and different types of trauma, and there's a lot of resources. There's many writing exercises that allow for this kind of self-exploration. And there's also a lot of body and mindfulness practices that help with nervous system regulation. It could be used together in a partnership. It could be used just for yourself. So it's basically a tool that has a lot of information packed in this book. And also what I love about it most, it has a lot of illustrations. We worked with an amazing illustrator, and so it's also playful. It does not everything has to be always so serious. So it's a piece of creative work that hopefully promotes for creativity and curiosity within the person.
And who knows, maybe picking up this workbook may take someone to start writing about their trauma and say, wait a second, this is way too much for me to handle. I definitely need to go get help. And maybe creates that little push that they might have needed to go get help from someone else.
Definitely. And also it could create writing, and it could turn into a memoir, which could then turn into connecting to a lot of other people and healing other people, right? Like, I think that is the power of healing. So when we heal ourselves, actually, the world around you changes, and you are also creating healing to the people around you. So it could also turn into something like that.
I love that. So why did you decide to write it, though?
The book, you mean Rewrite?
Yeah.
It's for this reason, actually. I kind of felt like an artifact for me. So I have a son, and I wanted something, for instance, when he goes through difficult experiences in life, I want him to be able to explore and be able to be resourceful and know his options. And I think the more that we have conversations around trauma, the more we have conversations around mental health, and the more that there are tools around it, then that becomes just more possible for people. And that's, I just wanted to have a small part in that.
I just love that. And the fact that you're actually trying to reach out and help others beyond your practice. So you have the heart for helping others. Now let's talk about generational curses. I was brought up in a family that children were seen, not heard. And I didn't have the greatest relationship with my mom, but my dad, I love my dad. Now, when I had 3 girls of my own, I chose to be the type of mom that I did not have. How important it is to break those generational curses so that you don't continue to pass the trauma down from generation to generation to generation.
The most important part, and congratulations for doing that in your own personal life, is I think we have to process our own woundings first. So the mothers, there's a lot of sacrifices that goes into mothering, right? Like Of course, being a mother is a blessing, and it's very much glorified, and it's a beautiful experience. It's also really challenging, and there's a lot of sacrifices that go into being a mother that is also actually not talked about often, right? Like for the pressure for women is so much when it comes to mothering, because not only is the expectation for them to be perfect mothers, but also they have to be good at their careers, and they have to be attractive, and they have to be social, and all these things, and make meals from scratch. And it's basically the standards for motherhood is just unreachable. And I think for that reason, the sacrifices that go into being a mother, and the pain and the trauma that the mother experienced, and I'm not just talking about personal trauma, but also certain narratives that are passed down, what it means to be a woman, and like that women have to make themselves smaller, or what it means to be, how successful can a woman be. Like narratives around these things have to be processed and expressed first. It's the parents' responsibility to process their difficult emotions, their traumas, and the narratives that were passed down to them, so that they don't pass it down to their own children. I think doing our own work as parents is our responsibility to our children, because it's not an excuse. Coming from an abusive home is not an excuse to recreate these stories. If we bring children to the world, we are responsible of protecting and loving them in the way that they deserve. And that goes from taking care of ourselves and healing our traumas first.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. One thing I want to hit on too is cultural. A lot of times, like, we have a multicultural family. My husband's a native of Mexico. So mental health is not something that they talk about there. And it's more the machismo. The man is like the head, and he's over everything. And luckily my husband's not like that, but it's hard when you're married into something that from somebody that's from another culture, marrying into or growing up with someone that has a total different value, then that can cause trauma as well until you kind of navigate it together, correct?
Definitely. And also, I think it's important to have the liberty to choose certain aspects of the culture and traditions and customs of what it is that you want to use in your family, and what it is that you want to continue in your family, and what has to go, right? I think that's the evolution of culture. Humans, we're always evolving, and we're always changing. So that is important to be aware of when we're also, practicing certain traditions. Some traditions are beautiful and warm and may work for your family, and some traditions may not work for your family. It's important to let go of the things that don't work. And also, there's certain traditions. For us, we're Turkish and we live here. And for us, there's certain traditions that we incorporate from this culture that we, practice and like, and some that from our own culture, from Turkish culture. So we created our own family culture around it. And I think it's important to do that, because it's not one fits all.
Yeah, because a lot of times, sometimes the culture brings in trauma of its own.
Definitely, yes.
So if someone was looking at your book and they say they want to pick it up and they want to work on rewriting and doing that trauma, what would be the one section you would tell them to focus on first?
I mean, I don't think there's, it depends on the person completely. I think, reading a little bit about what trauma is can be helpful, but it's not necessary. We don't have to exactly know the definition of trauma. There's a lot of writing exercises. That is a chapter that I like. So just like diving right into it, I'm that kind of a person. I never start from the beginning of things. I always dive right through the middle. Sometimes I peek at the end. So I always have to know how it ends.
Yep.
Before I get into it. So it depends on you have to just know what works for you and what your flow is.
What has been the response to this book?
It's been really actually encouraging, which is why right now we just submitted the second clinical book, and it's in press. It's coming out in the fall. It was actually received really well, which was very encouraging and very inspiring. A lot of people really enjoyed the writing exercises, and a lot of people actually really enjoyed that it was kind of a combination. So it wasn't like a textbook,
Mhm.
but it also had the information in it. So yeah, it was definitely received pretty well.
Have you had a chance to talk to anybody who's actually worked through some of the exercises in your book?
Yes, I actually, so in my private practice, the exercises came from my private practice.
Mhm.
So they were definitely tried out before. Um, and yeah, I mean, it's the change that can happen through the creative process is actually very powerful, and it is so inspiring to watch. I mean, I really consider this job that I have a privilege because I have seen so much transformation in my life and so much beauty come out of pain that it's just, yeah, it's very encouraging.
Yeah, it sounds like, and every time you talk about what you do, a huge smile comes across your face.
Yes.
Let's talk about the burnout though, because there's a lot of burnout with people that are dealing with mental health, that are mental health therapists, because there's not as many mental health therapists as there should be in the world.
Definitely, definitely burnout. I think, and as you're bringing up a very good topic, it's also a topic that's not talked about a lot. Burnout is, something that clinicians deal on their own silently, oftentimes. So it is definitely important to talk about. I think, especially like for instance, for me, it's important to take time off. It's so easy not to take time off.
Mhm.
It's kind of like parenting, right?
Yep.
It's because with parenting, it's so easy not to go to a yoga class or not go get a cup of coffee or go out for a walk on your own. It's so easy to do that. Those are the things that go first, right? Of course, you're
Mhm.
going to do things for your child and drive in places and prepare snacks, but if you're short on time, the first thing that's going to go is whatever you're doing for yourself. So as a mental health clinician, it's actually very similar. So for instance, when I travel, I don't take time off oftentimes. So I still work, and it's important to make sure that I actually put in vacation time, right? Have another clinician cover for me, because it's so easy for me to answer an email and say, yes, sure, of course I can meet. But to prevent burnout, if I'm going on a vacation, I make sure that I have another therapist covering for me, and that person is the contact person for anything that may come up while I'm not around. And sometimes it's hard to practice that, of course, but that is one thing that is very important, to make sure that you take your time, your own time for you. Also, certain like I try to stick with certain schedules. So I work 3 evenings. I try not to work the 4th evening, so that I have quality time with my family and all of that. As I said before, other clinicians have been a big, powerful tool for me to ground and process. And I also have a lot of things that I love to do. I love to write. I write fiction. So fiction writing for me is kind of like a sanctuary, and I always make sure that I have my writing time separate than my mental health, working time.
Mhm.
And yeah, so those are the things that I do for myself, but definitely burnout is important that we are aware of it and we talk about it and we reach out, just like we are, practice what you preach sort of thing.
Mhm. Yep, for sure. Now, our time is almost up. Is there any one thing that you would like to either make sure that people get from this interview, or something that maybe we didn't touch on that you want to share right now?
I think one thing that I think is important to close with, wherever you are in your journey, that is the right place to be. So I think for people who feel inclined to actually start working on their trauma, or start getting help for mental health, or explore further, that is the place you are. And for you, if you are not there yet, then that's okay too. I think, having like these kind of thoughts, like in the back burner, you might be preparing yourself for a journey that might take you to a whole different level. There's no rush. I think it's important to go with your own pace.
I love that. And tell people where they can find you, and then we'll talk about where they can find the book.
I'm very easy to find. Duygu Balan at Duygu Balan on Instagram, or my website, duygobalan.com. And the book is anywhere where you can find books.
And I've got the Amazon link going across the screen right now, because I think most people go to Amazon, because I think the pandemic has made most people go to Amazon as well.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you for coming on and for sharing about your book, for writing your book, for sharing about mental health, and for making it a topic that people talk about that's not a taboo anymore.
Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure talking to you.
Okay, guys, I will put in the show notes everywhere you can find the book and everything else. And until next time, be blessed. And most importantly, keep chatting. Bye.